About the work of missions to the end of the earth, and I pray it's something that you have interest in our book to realize that he is an important figure, and I think we'll see why tonight. I pray tonight. But this builds upon what we've been looking at now for several weeks. The subjects we've been looking at, you'll kind of begin to see how this great age of Protestant missions builds upon what's gone before it, because if you remember, like the second week of this class, we talked about the age of exploration. And we began to talk about all the merchants and all the exploring that was going on all over the world. And yet almost all of it, in fact, pretty much all of it was Catholic, like Roman Catholic. And the reason for that is simple. How else would it happen? You know, who else had the merchant vessels other than nations like Spain and Portugal? They were the dominant navies in that day, to go out and sail. But even then, it wasn't primarily missional. I mean, it was, I'm sure they would have said it's primarily missional, but it was primarily merchant, right? It was mercantile. They wanted to go out and do business in the Far East. They knew of tea. They knew of spices. They cared very much about having control of those things. And I mentioned that week that actually most of the spice trade was coming into Europe through the Middle East, through the Arab lands. And they wanted to find a way to circumvent that. You know, they wanted it for their own. They wanted to control it. And so they went down around the Horn of Africa and over toward India and made new routes. And so since these were Catholic nations, the Pope said, I'll authorize this on this condition. And that condition was you've got to take some priests with you. And if the Church with you wherever you go. And so that's what they did. They began to take them on every voyage. And so you see this interesting period where you see today like Indonesia and China and most notably Japan. We have much period where you saw a lot of the Catholic Jesuits there in a land like Japan, which is so unusual. It's an unusual time for that reason. But you'll notice not a lot of Protestants, and you might think, why did Protestants not get about this work? And you might think, well, they must not have cared about me. Trying to secure their own faith within their own borders, right? This was new, and just like we saw in Germany. There was still the 30 Years' War going on. They were trying to protect their borders from the Catholic armies that were coming up, the Holy Roman Empire that was trying to come in and push them out, saying the Lutheran. We looked at the Reformation. England, for instance, was a roller coaster ride, right? It's like King Henry, we're not quite sure. Well, Lady Jane Grey's going to put her on the throne. That'll make things secure. He's bounced out after just 8 days or whatever, right? Mary comes to the throne, be Catholicism again. Then Elizabeth, it's kind of like, you know, an Anglicanism. And then, but what about eventually Charles, right? Charles I, is he going to take us back to Catholicism? And so there's these ups and downs that happen for a long time in England. There's hardly ever a time at home that we can begin to think about overseas. Missionary work you saw in that age was mostly cross-border. You know, usually then they were fleeing for their lives. So they said, well, while we flee to, you know, while we flee to France, we'll try to evangelize some people, or fleeing out of France at times, right? So again, Roman Catholics having kind of a dominant position in missions, where you did see during that age movement across oceans in regard to the Protestant churches would be what? Settlement, expression of the exercise of religion. But yeah, you see that begin. Some Anglicans come for financial reasons, but Baptists and Congregationalists come in and start a community. And we have spoken, and it's going to be very important again tonight, about their eschatology, right? They were what we would call Christianization of the world right up until Christ comes back. So they were expecting great success, and we can see that in their writing. Because of that, they took risks because they thought they were helping to do that. and maybe some of our modern pessimism as you don't see the kind of risk-taking you see in the generation we're going to speak of tonight. But those men and women that came across be a city on a hill that would be an example of what a Christian community could be, right? Whatever that several weeks ago about how each one had their own kind of construction of that. So that, oftentimes there'd be a debate and one of them would leave and start a new colony, right? We talked about the Baptists and Providence in that way. But the idea was whatever church and culture that surrounds that, and we want to have a great society. And so that's where you would see some movement across oceans, but it wasn't what we traditionally think of in terms of missionary work. We did begin to see some missionary work during the days of the Great Awakening. You'll remember the Moravians were coming across, and we read about John Wesley and how he was coming across and was impressed with the Moravians. But he came across also as a missionary, so to speak. First of all, to a colony, to English. He also hoped to evangelize the natives, right? He wanted to go to the Indian tribes, as he would have called them, and evangelize them. So we see some movement of evangelism, some movement of missions to the New World in the 1700s. But again, I don't know how much interest someone like Wesley would have had in that if there weren't colonies of Brits there. I think, again, that's kind of the onboarding ground, right? He can come in, he's got a comfortable community he can launch out of, kind of like a beachhead in military terms, right? It's a beachhead to then go out into the tribes around. But again, you can't divorce what we're going to talk about tonight from the Frids, and kind of blossomed fully in the First Great Awakening, had great effects. Before that, ministers were mostly worried about and how they would minister to and evangelize the families in their church. Anything beyond that would be the people outside the church who need to be evangelized very at the beginning of his ministry. And then there were some measure of people in that day that, because of the state church issue, and you get into this thing of, well, is this person a Christian? And you're like, of course they are. They're an Englishman. And to be an Englishman is to be that you've got to watch. To be a Christian is to be an Englishman, right? So there was a little, and we've got to be careful. Carey battles a little bit against that idea that we can begin to think in terms of God's plan being to us, whatever that us is, Brits, Americans, Europeans, whatever it is, and not seeing the larger picture. So all of this is kind of the background on why Protestant mission passion for the gospel that began to develop over the course of the 1700s. It began to get people to say, if I'm reading my Bible correctly, and we just sang it, right, across the lands, Christ's mission is not just to the British Isles. It's not just to London. It's not just to England. It's not just to Great Britain. It's not just to the fullness of that, but it's to the lands. It's to all the ends of the earth. That's the mission. And see, it passionate about those things. Begin to say, can we do it? Can it be done? Is there a way to take the gospel out to the ends of themselves? Are reading about people we've already talked about. We talked in week 2, we mentioned Francis Xavier, who I mentioned a moment ago, the Catholic Church taking the gospel first to, or I should say taking to Japan. And so you've got a very interesting moment where Francis Xavier is having such great success in Japan, and men are reading about that. And it is interesting that that if for no other reason than the courage of men like Xavier, men like William Carey looked at them as kind of a model, or only for their courage, ingenuity, resourcefulness, and to some degree for. So you'll remember, as I mentioned, he was just beginning to go plan a mission into China when he died, and 1852, I think. So, I mean, that's a pretty remarkable thing to think about, traveling that much of the world in that day, and not just like 100 years later, we can do that as Protestants. Why can't we? We've got better ships today. We've got better funding and so forth. Why can't we do that today? Catholic Spain and Portugal dominated the seaways, right? They had to be defeated. And of course, England took care of that. Those ships from going out and exploring and making their own merchant lanes and so forth. And so all these things, stop and talk about all these things in detail. And it might be good to, but we would need about 10 more weeks to do it. So we'll just not be able to do that. But these occurrences are happening together, and Protestants now are able to go out. They're able to go down toward Africa and around the Horn of Africa and toward India, and they're beginning to say, why can't we take the gospel? Why can't we do this? I would also point out, again, the tie between evangelicalism, or the idea of evangelicalism in that day, and the Moravians, right? The Moravians are kind of a big influence on the evangelicals of England and America, but it was their dedication, right? Their dedication wherever they wanted to go. And so all that is having an effect on this generation. And so in the midst of all of that, there's a young man born named William Carey, and he is an extraordinary man, still remembered to this day as maybe the quintessential missionary. One of who knows how many. We don't even know how many from that generation. We know thousands or tens of thousands of people went into missions in that day. We know very few of their names. And part of that's because many of them died. And I don't just mean being killed. Some certainly were. Some died in shipwrecks or lost at sea. And many died. In fact, probably the most common way they died was within about 6 months in a new land, dysentery and various fevers that get in lands that they had no immunity to. And so it was a very dangerous work. And yet hearing this will take his place. It's a remarkable time in the church. So William Carey is born, and born in England on August 17th, 1761. His father was a weaver, he was a brilliant man. And so I think a little of that played into his success as a weaver. Like I said, he wasn't wealthy. I don't give the idea. I knew he was a smart man. Over time, one of the things that happened was the local township more stable income than as a weaver, because I guess in any industry that you're in, your business can go up and down. An occupation that was year-round. It also allowed William Carey to go to school, which he might not have. You may remember we talked about this with Whitefield, that Whitefield was able to get an education as a young man, as a youngster. Whitefield was blessed. I think, we talked about it at the time, and then he was able to go on to Oxford because he went as a servant, more or less. But the same fact, it's astounding, but it's reported that he taught himself Latin. They would not let him take a Latin. And as a child. And that might remind you of the great minister John Brown, who was a shepherd as a child and somehow was teaching himself Greek. It's hard to even know how he was doing that. And one day it saved up to Cambridge on foot, which was a day's journey, and to go in the bookstore and buy a Greek New Testament. And the man behind the counter, and he said, I can read it. And so one of the professors was in there and said, well, if you can give it to him, if he can read it, I'll buy it for him. And he read it, and so that professor bought it for him. So these weird things happen. God gives these people these amazing gifts. And so as a child, he teaches himself Latin. Years old in 1775, and his father withdraws him from school, not because he didn't know he was uniquely talented. He knew that, but he was growing needs. And in that day, if you're not likely to go to college, you go to work. And actually the world wasn't all that different all that long ago, right? You oftentimes, father being in weaving, he knew how to thread and do those sorts of things, and a lot of shoes in that day involved that sort of thing. And so he was good at repairing shoes and that pair of shoes. And so he did that. Now, this is providential for a couple of reasons. First of all, there's a man there with him, and through this interaction, that he invited William Carey to church, which is an amazing thing. And William Carey had grown up in Anglican, people did, and certainly it would have been a lot more difficult for his father to be made the town schoolmaster if he had not been an Anglican, and thinks this is it. This is it. Really the beginning step toward him ended up being a Baptist, right, which was just another congregational church. But particularly when it regards credo baptism as opposed to pedo baptism. And so he became a Baptist over time. The other thing that happened during this time is he was given the workload of, I want you to do, so he would work really diligently and expertly, and he'd get the shoes repaired very quickly. And then he Greek during this time, a little bit of help from another man who had a classical education and knew Greek, but he learned Koine Greek during this time. It's also during this time that he not only becomes a Baptist, but gets a reputation in the churches he's attending, really smart and understanding difficult doctrines pretty quickly. And when that happens, people recognize that you're educated on these things. People begin to think, would you like an opportunity to teach something or to do something like that? And so there's some positives happening for him. But all this changes in 1779 when the man he was apprenticed to dies. And now suddenly the life that he's kind of carved out for himself is gone. And this was often a problem in that day. If you were apprenticed under someone, that the general way that would work is you would work under them, and you would work for many, many years. And when they would retire or die, you would kind of buy them out of their thing. And then you would be the main guy, and you would apprentice somebody under you. It was a really efficient system. And but this man died, and Carey certainly wasn't ready to buy him out, couldn't. He had no opportunity to do so. And so he goes to work for another. For instance, a tinker like John Bunyan might not be interested in hiring you, right? You don't lines up with my skill set. It's not that you can't learn new skill sets, but a lot of times employers don't want to take the time to train you in a new set of skills, right? So this is a problem then too. That's what I'm trying to say. It was a difficulty in this day as well. Again, this is God shining brightly, I believe, upon William Carey and preparing him for what first wife. He's married 3 times. His first, all 3 of his wives actually, I believe, died before him. And is Thomas Old's sister-in-law. So that's how he meets her, through his employment with him, and falls in love with her. She was illiterate, which was not uncommon at that time. It's pointed out oftentimes that on her marriage certificate, she just put a cross, which the stresses upon their marriage happen very quickly in their marriage. They have a child after child very early on. In those days, if your child made it past 3 or 4, you thought, okay, now we've got a really good chance. Of stress on his wife. I mean, I'm sure it did for him as well, but particularly she seemed to take these losses very hard. Stress. But Thomas Ode apparently had made an arrangement by which, even though William Carey probably was not in the position to take over the business, so a very kind occurrence. So William Carey runs that business, and his talent shines through again, right? He's because he wants to continue his previous practice, right? Which was get my work done quickly, and then while I'm sitting here waiting, he's wanting to learn. He's wanting to devour books, and but during this few years, Italian, Dutch, French, just one of these men who's just a genius, right? Like a polyglot or whatever you call it. Just can, whenever he sets his mind to learn, it seems he learns quickly. And so, very quickly subjects. And during this time, he reads 2 books. So just the idea, when he's reading theology, he's not just reading the Puritans. He's not just reading books on language. And this also helped his business, by the way, having all these language skills. But he reads, and he read two books during this time that changed his life forever. And one of those books we've already talked about. I'll start with the one we haven't. He read the journals all time. I'll come back to that book in just a second. The other book, the end of the Great Awakening week, which was the journals of David Brainerd. And you may remember really suffered and worked to take the gospel to these tribes and dying. And we talked about the fact that it was Jonathan Edwards' daughter that nursed him in those last days while he was impressed by his life, that he made sure those memoirs of his missionary work got published. And 1760 or so. So we're talking about like 15 years later, these records, these books have made it across the Atlantic Ocean back to England. And here a cobbler working in a shoe store, somebody says, you need to read this book. You know, we don't appreciate it's here in no time at all, right? They just send a digital file over, print it here, and put it in the stores, right? The shelves of the stores. And so it's amazing how quickly this book gets across to England and he reads it. And so what I think we can recognize here is a couple of ways these books transformed him and his life. The first one was as he read about David Brainerd, and he read about this commitment to the gospel, this commitment to evangelism, this commitment to missions, and to taking the gospel to people. Was astounded, really, to read someone who this was their. And it awoke something in him of a desire, you know, what Paul says, to go and preach the gospel. Many missionaries, this is their thing. It's like, I want to be the guy. I don't think it's about self-glory. It's just that's the mission book, I think, is we can see why it's important. Captain Cook is the great explorer of the Pacific. Those island chains and mapping them and writing about his experiences there, and then makes it to Hawaii and dies. You'll see where this book is republished. Companies will put out special editions of Captain Cook, and that's just a wonderful thing to read. You can explore those voyages that Captain Cook took. So it had an effect on a young man who maybe didn't even know he had a heart for exploration, but all of a sudden thinking about the South Seas and thinking about the South Pacific and a desire to go somewhere over there, right? Don't know where, but somewhere, first of all, to India. He knew that's a smart place to begin. And we also would be remiss not to mention that the East India Trading Company was already there in India, already at work. There was already a lot of Englishmen there. So if you're looking for a foothold, if you're looking for a mission station, if you're looking for that beachhead to begin your work, this is a good place to do it. And so he decides, well, India would be a good place to go. Now, if you're interested in a lot more of that, there are books written certainly on him. But I want to go back and say during this same time, increasingly involved in being an able not only teacher, but defender, an apologist for before. I just think this is really important. You know, a lot of our defenses of our understanding of baptism in the last 100 years just comes from a reaction against paedobaptism, right? We're like, well, we don't think you should baptize babies. But in that day, they recognized that it was tied to our covenant theology, and that's vitally important. If you understand what we believe about salvation, the history of salvation, what God's been revealing and doing all throughout the Old Testament, that's what it's rooted in. That's where the Baptists came from, was from saying, we like almost everything about you Congregationalists and you Presbyterians. We just think you made one little error here in your understanding of what's happening with Abraham. And so Carey becomes an able understander of that, or he understands it well. During this time, in this small area he's in, it's kind of amazing. he becomes friends with some Baptist pastors, kind of influential guys, Daniel Ryland and Andrew Fuller, two of the great early Baptists, and becomes friends with them. And in fact, they offer him his first opportunities to preach church and fill the pulpit. So he's running around, as it were, with like some pretty solid guys, theologically, good preachers. And Andrew Fuller in particular is important. And Andrew Fuller is still published today. I mean, so is Daniel Ryland, but I mean, Andrew Fuller is still majorly published today. And he was a really important guy because he was already in some battles in his day, not just in Baptist circles, but in broader Christian circles, of arguing that there was something like an attitude of what I think we'd call today like hyper-Calvinism, that it was running amok in the churches, which is to say something like, well, if you're going to hold to the doctrines of grace, you shouldn't even worry about evangelizing anybody, because if it's God's intention to save them, he'll do it. And if it isn't, you're wasting your time. So there was this kind of idea of being against missions. And Andrew Fuller was out there saying, no, take the message out to every person and preach the gospel. 1789, this is really an important time. William Carey becomes a Baptist pastor and begins to preach regularly. Super important. If you're going to be a missionary, we often forget this. One of maybe our flaws in our mission work today is, it's good to be a pastor for a while before you're a missionary, because you need to and learn to get along with people and all that sort of thing that you have to do as a pastor. Because if you just put out in the mission field, you may not really be ready for all the challenges you're going to find there. And we see that. We see a lot of people who go into the pastorate and don't make it. I don't just mean at one church. They don't make it in the pastorate long. We also see many missionaries who go out and they're out of missions altogether because it's challenging work. I mean, who would think it isn't? And so he's an aspect to his preaching. He preaches a sermon out of Isaiah in which he talks about God's mission is to take the gospel to the ends of the earth. Now, we're about to take a little bit of break from Isaiah, but I mean, how many times have we heard that kind of message in Isaiah in the first 23 chapters? I mean, we're not even to the part yet, the ends of the earth, and yet in the first 23 chapters, we've seen it over and again that God is going to take my message of salvation to the Egyptians and to the Assyrians and to the ends of the earth, and all the nations shall come to me. He uses that, and he preaches in this that we need to have a bigger vision, as God has given it to us in Scripture, to be involved in reaching the nations. And this is the sermon in which that line that we've talked about came from, which was expect great things from God, do great things for God. That if we want to see God work in great ways, we're the means he's calling. So let's get about it and do great works and expect that he is going to bless it. In other words, if it's his mission for us to preach the gospel to a church, preach the gospel to the church, but expect it to be effective. If it's to take the gospel to India, expect that God's going to do a work in India, whatever it may be. And don't be crushed if it doesn't happen in your time. The great missionary Amy Carmichael, we've got a book on her in our library, A Time to Die, I believe is the title of it. And it's an interesting story because she wasn't having results for the first couple of years, and the mission boards were like, pull the funding. And people who knew her work said, don't pull the funding, let her continue. It's not in our time. We don't get to say 2 years, and if it's not 2 years, there's nothing going on. She's seen some things happen. This is a story, by the way, of many missionaries that get in the field. They work for a time. They're just on the verge of seeing some things happen. They go, for the first time, I feel like I saw the Spirit, moving in a way discernible. And that's about the time the mission board says, nope, it's been 3 years. Nobody's had a baptism or conversion. Come home. We'll send you somewhere else. There's a lot of problems with this way of thinking, just like we're talking about. We don't schedule revivals. We can't schedule these things. God works in the ways that he chooses to. And so anyway, we need to think about those things. But he began to preach this. We need to be at work doing this. And later, as a pastor, 1792, he wrote a book. I'm going to hold, it's really not a book, it's a book of weeks. It's by William Carey, An Inquiry into the Obligations of Christians to Use Means for the Conversion. This changed the world. I mean, I don't think it's an exaggeration to say that God, talking about, he uses means, William Carey, to change the world, because William Carey wrote this, and it's an interesting work. I mean, I don't want to spend too much time here tonight. You'll get a copy of it in a few weeks and you can read it, as to show visually that the gospel is taken to Jerusalem. It's pictured in Paul's coming to Rome, because it was widely known in that day that every road leads to Rome and from Rome, right? So if you get to Rome, it's as if you've gotten to the end of the world. That's kind of, a lot of people think that's the intention of the way Luke structured Acts. But by the days of William Carey, people are saying, well, that's already been done. The effective world God wanted to reach, he already did it. We don't need to do that. We just need to stay here in our communities and do what we're doing. So he begins to answer. He gives a history of missionary efforts, a survey of the present state of the world, the practicality of something more being done for the conversion of the heathen, and then the duty of Christians and means to be used in this work. And if you read this, you will read a man who is answering objections. He is answering all the things that you'll say, and read it because I think it'll help you to read it, not hurting you in reading it. William Carey basically calls out his generation, who says it's impractical, it's too hard, it's dangerous. He says, well, it's funny how that didn't stop you all from going to those same countries for merchant purposes. It was costly to do that, but when it was about tea or tobacco, or when it's for the gospel, you say it's too hard. Now that's more or less effectively keep you from reading it, but more or less he's just calling out his generation, saying, do we have a vision for what God is? And so he begins to, in writing this, it shakes things up. He goes to one of the local Baptists, speak about missions and the need for missions. And it's reported that one of the old said, you're an enthusiast, young man, which that was almost like the worst thing you could say to somebody in that day. You're an enthusiast, because, continued. And the same year that he wrote this work, later that year, he started the Baptist Missionary Society. And this is revolutionary. This is why he's the father of modern. He said, I've been sitting here at my own church thinking, how am I going to send a missionary to India? Well, let's say we've got a young man or a young family, doesn't matter. They want to go. There's some nation they feel God has called them to. And I get up, pastoral duty, Christian duty. The Spirit's leading me to preach a sermon on how if this young man is feeling led to go, and we all sense that he is, and that the Lord is using him in that sense, we need to find a way to happen. But still yet, in a church our size, it may not be possible, right? I mean, it may not be that you can even do it. Now, it depends on how sacrificial we get, right? That's the thing. Okay, well, we're not going to be able to do it as an individual congregation, perhaps. But what if 2 or 3 congregations join together? A lot of difficulty in this, because a lot of the Anglican churches or whatever denomination, congregational, and they were like, I don't know if society kind of became a parachurch organization. Now, I hate to say this, because in a way that might be the one negative about it too, right? And a lot of people that were interested in missions and send people out. Which I don't think is totally good, right? Because in this day, one of the things that you'd say about what we those missionaries answered to a small group of churches, 10, 15 churches. The church itself couldn't fund Notice that. They weren't trying to step on any additional toes beyond that. Become a missionary supported by the Baptist Missionary Society. Well, you would have been most likely a member in one of those churches, right? So as those 15 or 20, whatever the number would grow to be, churches are together. They say, well, I've got a young man or I've got a young family in my congregation that I believe are called. Well, what happens? These churches are nearby. Let's talk to him. Let's see if we all agree, if we all sense that calling. In other words, these missionaries, even though it was through an organization, we're still, is this model of, the church at Antioch sent out Paul and Silas. Missionaries were tied to churches. Now, I'm not saying no goods come out of what William Carey did here. I'm just saying it started this trend where now we see more and more things done by parachurch organizations. And there are obvious problems with that. It's not my purpose to get into this tonight too much, but there are problems there. For instance, there's a lot of weird things that are going on with some of that I don't think is quite the biblical model. Now, that whenever you start something, it can kind of have some side consequences too. In his day, he began to see some of those dangers at the end of his life. He separated from the Baptist Missionary Society at the end of his life because of disagreement over methods as new missionaries came in. And so we'll come back to that in just a moment. 1773, 1 year after he starts, nobody else could go, so send me. I think he longed to go. He went to India. A difficult journey. His wife isn't sure she really wants to go. So she at first doesn't want to go. He and another man and his family, and I think his oldest son, board a ship, and then they're basically cast off the ship a month or so in a dispute with the East India Tea Company. Unapproved passengers, and they had not been approved, so they kicked them off, likely because they were Baptists, and the East India Tea Company was trying to exit to Calcutta. Nothing but problems. From day one. By the way, that wife to catch up, and she ended up coming. From the very beginning, it's difficulties for him, and probably not so much today. It's not, our missionaries usually live in nice facilities, but in this day, it was difficult. And you see this. They have two major problems. The East India Trade Company, they're giving them a lot of trouble because they don't want them in Calcutta. And his eldest son died very early on in his time in India. And his wife, who already wasn't sure she wanted to come and doesn't like India. And there's a lot of people who write about what exactly happens to her. But, in that day, more or less, they just say she went crazy. That's what most of the accounts are like. You need to find an asylum. Translating the New Testament, and she'd be screaming at the top of her lungs in the next room. Just constantly screaming, shouting, and, she lost many members of her family, many of her friends, and so this was a difficult thing. He took care of her until she passed away, and then a few years later got remarried, and again, he was married 3 times. His wife got sick. Each of them got sick and died. But during that time, he had trouble financially because, again, there was no help coming from British representatives. There was no help coming from the East India Company, which was a major company. And so a friend of his said, hey, listen, I know a guy that's got a plant that needs a manager. If you'll go over there, I think you will. Because it allowed him finance and a steady job. And then he used all of his time to translate the Bible into all the dialects there in India. And so he could translate it into Pashtun. And just amazing, this guy's language skill. the Mission Society sent two more missionaries, William Ward and Joshua Marshman. Other one's skill was, but they arrive and they had been to go to Calcutta and to go to another colony nearby, the Danish colony of Srirampur, and this would be a place that they would have. I guess it was just known that so closely, and their work is so important together. It allows them now. They have all this work that's translated now, and within about a year after this, they have their first actual convert, a man named of things. And to say, if you're interested in these things, you can read a lot more about it. But the ministry that you see with William Carey now, there's a lot of, how do you deal with the caste system in India, right? Then you just kind of reinforce a system you may not agree with. Or if you say we won't recognize it, so William Carey was very careful with these things in the way he did. Actually, I believe in this book you'll read some of that. He wrote broadly than this, but you'll read some of his ideas that still stick with us today. On he just had a great understanding of culture and saying whatever Indian Christian in a certain part of Africa might not sound like Christian worship will in Antarctica, right? I mean, that's probably a bad example, but let's just say Sweden, right? And I mean, we recognize there are differences. Now, there are some things where you do have to take a stand. And William Carey, one of those things where he takes a stand is there was a practice that, okay, no, this isn't cultural, this is moral, right? We cannot stand for this. So he went and personally on a Sunday, and he was a strict Sabbatarian. So he's like, what do I do, And so he actually wrestled for about 10 minutes with, should he wait till the next day to publish this order to get it out? Because it's clear in Scripture that the Sabbath can be worked on if it's for the purpose of saving. Selling that idea. But anyway, to make a long story short here, William Carey is a kind of for missions of saying, look, we can bring all the Europeans we want over here. We can bring all the British men over here we want. The most effective missionaries will be ones we raise up in the country itself. The best thing we can do is begin to see them evangelize their own people. A, there's not the cultural boundaries. B, there's not that whole thing of we don't know if we can trust, right? You're at the very beginning, he said, yes, we have to send missionaries to get the ball rolling, but a lot of our work should be to try to develop missionary smart and to be wise in what we confront. And just said, all of your culture must fall. And I think you can kind of, in a way, see that. They would think, what does Christianity look like? Right, or whatever. For me, it looks like Johnson City, Tennessee. That's what Christianity looks like. But and I think that he was saying we need to be ready to accept that Christianity in Africa or India may not look like in England, and we've got to be okay with that, as long as it is sound, cultural to them. And these ideas were challenging and controversial at the time, but really kind of goes back to what we say now. It's the lyric thing. I don't know if it was here or the nursing home. I was talking about this recently, but it was Sunday night here in the Psalms. They say set to, a deer at dawn or whatever, but the deer at dawn music is not recorded in Scripture. It's not preserved. And I think that if a tribe or people in India song, although I think there's a lot written on how Newton himself probably got that from African chants, that he got the music for Amazing Grace from, resets it to a different kind of music. What difference does it make, right? If that music is good music and pleasant music in a language or their own words, again, as long as they're sound, there shouldn't be an issue. And so the Baptist Missionary Society, but other ones started up, Church Missionary Society, London Missionary Society, and sometimes then Anglicans would help individual Anglican, very much in a modern age where like, if there might be some kind of Billy Graham, different denominations helping to fund it, that was kind of the beginning of that. And so most of our mission stuff today follows this sort of, it's still hundreds or thousands, maybe even tens of thousands of individual churches pooling their money. And all this kind of comes after the example that's given to us by William Carey. One college and eventually a university. I mentioned his kind of breakup with by the way, I'll just say you quickly, part of the problem was he liked that they lived in a very small town. To encourage one another and to have a community. And some of the newer missionaries wanted their own facilities and their own. When the society agreed with them over him, then he said, well, I don't want to be a part of this anymore. And I think in the one sense, you could think, well, maybe that's being childish about it, but I don't think so. I think he saw the danger if missionaries, this sort of thing. But, what is a good life for a missionary or for a pastor? What does it mean to be taken care of, to live? But there's also, we live in an age where you're going and living in a really nice home. I mean, and what I mean by this is the people you're ministering to have nothing, and you've got the best of it to take care of you, that it could lead to a day where missionaries really, it's not even a sacrifice, right? It's like you in places like that, and you can buy a property on the beach and you can live like a prince, right? Not to serve themselves. And so there was a real concern, I think, that Carey had that. So at the end of his life, he moved on campus at the university, very dedicated to, and laying on a couch, reading. He died on it. Got transported back to Oxford and is in the Baptist house at Oxford, Regent College Park House. But obviously that's not his legacy. His legacy is that he had a vision for missions and a desire for missions, and he inspired, said, in what he had done. And just a couple of those missionaries, we obviously don't have time to go into their lives in that kind of detail. Baptist men like Livingston, who went into Africa and some of the great adventures. He went there, interestingly enough, for the purpose, he said, of Christ and commerce. What he was hoping to do, he rightly recognized that one of the great challenges of Africa was slavery. There are social issues that are raging all during this time, and one of them is this, slavery. And soon men like William Wilberforce, who made it their goal to end slavery and the international slave trade. But how are we going to ever evangelize these tribes if they're always at war against each other? One of the important things to remember was a lot of the kidnap or defeat a tribe and take them and sell them. And so Livingston's idea was, what we need to do is we need to develop ways that these tribes can make enough money that they're not doing that, it ends. It ends. I mean, even the slave boats from England never were brought to them. And so his idea was Christianity can be what enslaved and develop these different tribes to have financial means by which they can do this. So that was his. That was his big mark. The other big person that, if we had an extra week, we want to talk about Judson, one of the great American missionaries, another Baptist. And in fact, when he was going to Burma, that was his place. He stayed in Burma for 40 years and sacrificed, going first to India so he could meet William Carey, which is kind of neat to think in William Carey's own day, he was that famous that another interest in meeting Carey really led to him being one of the most going to go meet Carrie. I need to be, he wants to talk about it. I know he's a Baptist. So he was really reading up more and more on Baptist doctrine and theology, and then went to Burma and was one of the great missionaries. They went there and died very quickly, or they went there and worked faithfully for decades, but for whatever reason, their work just didn't get out. It didn't get known. The Lord knows their names, and one day we'll get to meet those people. And that's kind of the beauty of what we do as the Lord's people. You know, casting seeds out, right, in our own families, churches, communities, and then some of us even. And God knows how all that comes together. We can't, but He does. And so, you know, missionaries and servants of the Lord that there was during this time that risked everything. I mean, literally risked everything to go and sail the ocean and go into a land where they didn't know what would find them there, all that Jesus may be known. And it's an amazing time. I don't in no way want to take away from modern missions. We need to be more about missions than we are today. But I'm just saying, you know, now you can learn a lot about a country before you ever go. And in that day, it was a different thing, right? I mean, even if you like studied every resource available to you on Burma, like say Judson would have. Okay, but it's going to take you. I mean, how long ago were the resources you're reading written? They might have been written 2 or 3 years before. Relevant resources might be 4 or 5 years old. So I mean, you could be entering a country that's very much changed from the one that you prepared. Just for many of our missionaries today, I want to close by saying that we still that go to Muslim countries where it is dangerous, who try to sneak into North Korea, where it's instant death sentence. You know, Christianity is outlawed there. And for falling asleep during one of his speeches, which he did do, what's he going to do to you as a Christian? Right? Just for coming across the border for the cause of Christ today. I don't want to make that sound like that's only something a couple hundred years ago. But is this vision, this dream of seeing the world reached, and a desire to enter into that work. We know that have visions like that, of not visions, but I mean have a desire to serve the Lord. And when those things happen, we have in our congregation, or maybe in a brother or sister congregation, maybe again, like I said, we don't have the means we can. And lastly, I want to brag on this congregation, because many times we've had he knew about, and our church funded that mission for him. Then there was another young man that he knew that was having trouble, I guess, raising the funds, so we raised the funds for him as well. That was also going on that mission trip and had everything funded except her plane ticket, and we bought her plane ticket too. And for a small church, and I pray that we'll be doing that in the future when the Lord gives us, you know. Anyway, I think that's really everything I had that I was going to say. So if anybody has any questions or comments, thoughts. Oh no, that's okay.
No, I was just thinking, especially in light of recent events.
Mm-hmm.
But
Yes.
and we have opportunity to evangelize those that might be going back to their country.
Yes.
A lot of encouragement, and it told to go to all the earth.
Yes.
But just looking at our current culture, we are in dire need.
Yeah. Right.
That knows the gospel, or should know the gospel.
Yes.
How do we encourage one another? I was thinking about going overseas to Turkey to mission work. I said, well, are you doing it here?
Mm-hmm.
Because if you're not sharing the gospel here, then it's important. But
Yes.
there's a need.
Yes.
And I'm just talking to myself, because for the majority of my Christian life, me, at least.
Yes. So So I'll say this. I think this was really largely the question. He's living in an age where they're not even doing the evangelism at home either, right? And it's children in the church that was effectively being a Christian. And so the evangelical movement was first saying there are people outside these walls that the gospel, and a lot of people inside these walls that they think being a Christian is just equivalent to being in a Christian family. And so some of them need to hear the gospel. So it's beginning, first of all, with the realization of the gospel, what the message of the gospel was. Christianity, to have your name on a roll somewhere or to have been dunked underwater somewhere. That being born again by the Spirit of God and all that. So first of all, that evangelical awakening has to happen where people begin to think again, what does it mean truly to be a Christian? It should be evangelized by the church in that community, right? By the Christians of that community. So again, it would be really sad. I mean, we talked about this, right? That like South Korea is sending missionaries over here. That's really sad because we ought to. But I think that really goes to William Carey's point that we were talking about earlier. His vision for how the world then is evangelized is we have to send people to take the seed, right? The sower has to go. They have to carry the gospel. That part. But his vision was it shouldn't be a permanent enterprise, right? Where we have an industry of sending people all the time. We ought to be trying to get a church started in that country, community, group, whatever it is. And then that's their job now. Evangelize your people, right? Evangelize your culture. And so I think that is the roadmap. We should be dealing with our community. That doesn't mean that God won't raise up individuals right here that may have a country, wherever it might be. And, maybe Europe. I mean, we're getting to the point where the European church is becoming, in certain countries, virtually non-existent. And so, all those things, I don't think they're incompatible, right? It's like it's both those. And things are a little bit strange. Means of evangelizing is also changing. I've mentioned this many times. Like if you look at these broadcasts that we do, this little church in a little city, I didn't understand it in terms of, like English, but a lot of these things now have where they generate, a transcript. And now Sermon Audio is working on an AI feature where it will take what we put in, different languages they have. So we're living in an unusual age where there are many more ways that people can be evangelized than before. Still books, still kinds of crazy things happening. Not crazy, I should say. It's just unusual to people 100 years ago, right? But anyway, any of my books from seminary, I kept them never knowing when I'd need them. But one of my missions books, on one of the classes I took, kind of like a history of missions, but in reverse, like in a way that so it mentioned that when the Goths, then what happened? The Goths came and took over Rome, and then they became Christianized, right? And that actually, if he used that as God brings the world to them, and so. You can look at Europe today. The nations are all in Europe today, right? I mean, you've got people from everywhere in Europe today and in history of that happening. And so, it's just a reminder. God has a mission, right? The word's going to go out to the ends of the earth. And if we don't want to see our Western nations collapse like Rome did, it might be a good idea to start sending missionaries out and proclaim the gospel. Work. I mean, if God is going to take the gospel to the ends of the earth, it's going to get there somehow. And but here's a model that we see in history of men and women taking it and starting churches. And I think I don't want to get too controversial here, but work of the missionary is to go and get a church started. And hopefully a church that is And then now that work has begun organically in their own land. That's what you see in the go, and they start a church somewhere and they train up leaders. And maybe Paul stays for a while, and maybe he comes back to fun sometimes for them. But it's expected that church now is going to grow and survive, I just can't imagine that Paul ever thought the model would be, we'll keep bringing people, from Antioch. Every couple of years, we'll send more people from Antioch and just try to keep this thing going. And, we don't always take the best approach. And sometimes I'm afraid there's good financial reasons why it isn't always in everybody's best interest to have an independent. Just stop there. Just stop there.
Situation with Anthony. I kind of think of him as a missionary.
Yes.
He would get run out of the country.
Yeah, so it's always dangerous, right? It's always dangerous. Any kind of missions in certain. So right now he's just training, right? He's training. He's got some other things that he's doing, but be interesting to see how the Lord uses him. Yeah, for sure. But anyway. All right. Well, let's have a word of prayer, and then we'll call. Oh, I'm looking at you. It's Nick over here. So used to Allie being the person coming up. All right. For this amazing history of missions, Father, we recognize it's always a struggle. Difficult things, but you promise us that you're involved in things. And we see that in people like William Carey and Judson and they went and often did suffer and sometimes suffered greatly, but they went to see the gospel proclaimed in our homes, in our workplaces, in our community, and yes, even for those that you call to take the gospel out into new lands. Father, we know that work is not complete. And so we pray that we would be a people who desire to see it continue. And so, Father, give us opportunities to join in that work, not only in the work to new places, but even to support that work where we need to, where it's begun. And also to support that work in our vision for just seeing your church just glorious. Things that you've called us to do. Father, we love you.